Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of the Libertarian Listener with me, Chris Wilkinson. I'm joined today by CALLUM McNEILL. He's an overseas university lecturer. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
All's well over here. The first topic of conversation for this episode is political leadership. So the lockdown is continuing to be relaxed after the daily death rate reached its lowest level since late March. I've got a quote from the Mirror here. Modelling last week suggested the average number of people who catch coronavirus from each person who has it varies massively. It is said to be 0.8 in the northeastern Yorkshire, but just 0.4 in London. Yet the government has not given an official estimate. Now, considering that there are statistical variations, it would seem to me that a phasing out of the lockdown according to each region would be a sensible move if the public are significantly concerned by it. What do you think the best approach would be to end the lockdown?
That's a good question, because I know that coming from experience, I know people in all regions of the UK, and obviously they have different opinions and approaches to how they would end said lockdown. I think it's more important to understand that the way in which each of the regions within the UK have reacted shows that there's been a discontinuation of belief or any form of belief in the management introduced or currently being used by the current central government, i.e. Boris Johnson's government and the Department of Health and Social Work under the direction of the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock. So the whole idea that we are united, all of us are united in combating this terrible disease clearly isn't the situation which is currently going on, because every region in the UK has their own separate management or ideas in how to combat such a version of lockdown. Take, for instance, the three devolved regions within the UK, so Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, are all ignoring the advice given by Boris Johnson and his government and are doing their own independent lockdown phasing, which they believe would be more beneficial for their citizens than listening to the advice from the public health authorities, i.e. the Department of Health under Matt Hancock. And honestly, I'm not being biased or anything towards the central government here, but I can completely understand why the devolved governments have decided to take their own form of lockdown procedures and processes instead of following the ways in which England independently has been or planning to do their lockdown exiting.
Boris Johnson's net approval rating slipped below that of his political rival Keir Starmer for the first time this week, and Sir Keir has topped the last three net approval polls while support for Boris is rapidly declining. But Keir has a significantly higher amount of undecided responses. So what do you think has been the primary cause behind Boris's poll decline? Is it the poor handling of the pandemic?
I'd say one way of analysing the current political situation, especially coming with political leadership in a time such as this, would be completely the way in which Boris Johnson has delegated the processes of the UK government in handling an issue such as this, and the fact that Boris is seen by a certain majority of the public to misinterpret and misunderstand the importance of public perception and public opinion, particularly looking at public health and not focusing on public health, but then only referring to the re-establishment of the political economy. So in a nutshell, the leadership of Boris Johnson is clearly showing that this Conservative government is only focused on the instructions of the economy instead of focusing on public health. However, looking at the recent polls, it clearly shows that the new approach in leadership from the newly elected leader of the Labour Party is giving a fresh and organic meaning to what political leadership truly is. And people are clearly getting quite sick of the same old responses from the current Prime Minister and no clear sense of direction with the lockdown. At that case, as you could completely see with the speech for which the Prime Minister gave last Sunday with his direction of the lockdown easing.
Well, one of the opinion polls out this week showed a 3% net disapproval rating for the government's handling of the coronavirus response, but the Conservatives are still holding a strong lead in the party opinion polls, which is also in decline. But what it suggests is that there's perhaps a weak or mistrusted opposition, and I wonder how many people are regretting voting for the Conservatives back in December. Is it more of a case of Conservative weakness than Labour strength at the moment?
Like I've said previously, the new approach undertaken by the new Labour leadership does pose a significant threat politically to undermine the Conservatives' credibility as the UK government, and obviously the public are becoming aware of this.
Do you think that the trend will continue and translate into future local elections, perhaps even the next general election?
Labour and the left, political left, are on a clear and defined pathway to re-establish themselves as a credible opposition party. Now there is no infighting between the factions within the Labour Party, for instance, under Keir Starmer, unlike there was with the previous leadership of Jeremy Corbyn and the shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, John MacDonald. So to conclude this part, that the fact that the new Labour leadership is producing a Labour Party that's more focused on the future instead of looking to the past like it was under the previous leadership.
I suppose there's evidence of this, and one of the things I was thinking of was how in Prime Minister's Question Time, Keir Starmer seems to have got the wind over Boris Johnson, and it finally seems as though the Labour Party is really kicking and really making the concerted effort to regain office at the next election. I don't know if you agree with that.
I completely agree with that, because I feel that the new leadership given by Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner is clearly showing that there is the resurgence of Labour in that sense to re-establish themselves as a credible party for the UK government. And this is clearly shown in the way in which Sir Keir Starmer handles Boris Johnson within PMQs, because as Keir Starmer, what I like about his approach is the fact that Keir Starmer takes a legal and critical analysis approach, whereas on the other side of the house, there seems to be some version of discommunication between what Boris Johnson is trying to tell the public and what he's actually doing. So there seems to be a mismanagement within the Conservative Party and other internal government departments as well.
Right, just to move it on, the next topic is on the reopening of the schools, and I've talked over the past couple of weeks in previous episodes that there's glaring policy contradictions emerging as the lockdown measures are eased. The Sun seemed to sum it all up by saying that Brits are able to have cleaners over to work in their homes and have people over to view properties on the market, but still can't see friends and family. People can meet in pairs outside as long as they stay 2 metres apart, but can't see both parents at the same time. And people in England are not allowed to go on day trips across the country, but cannot cross into Wales and Scotland where different rules are in place. What are your thoughts on these contradictions?
I'd say they're obviously causing significant amounts of confusion and agony and anguish for large swathes of the population. As I've said previously, there has been mismanagement and miscommunication and messages that haven't been clearly interpreted, firstly by government departments to ensure that the UK population clearly understands the importance of these rules. I know that Scotland and Wales has a particular different approach to this because of its system of being a devolved nation or devolved government. However, there should be a clearer approach to this matter.
I know you've alluded to it already, and there's a lot of commentators who would say that Boris pretty much won England at the election but didn't really win anywhere else. Is Boris playing to England's needs and not the needs of the United Kingdom as a whole?
That's a very good question, Chris, because obviously Boris Johnson currently although he is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, which makes up 4 separate countries, these countries have their own political ideologies, which are clearly being shown during this pandemic. So obviously you've got Scotland under Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish government saying we're going to keep the lockdown in place, but obviously restrictions will be lifted at a time which is safe to do so. Whereas you go south of the border in England under Boris Johnson and it's complete and utter mayhem. It's kind of indicating that Boris is only focusing on the importance of England, particularly with core voters in the home counties. He doesn't really give a damn about voters within the north of England, i.e. Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, for instance, or Birmingham, who clearly oppose his leadership and his handling alongside other ministers towards the pandemic.
Do you think that the public perception of him is therefore of a bit of a control freak and a domineering prime minister?
This is going to sound very controversial. However, I honestly believe that Boris Johnson is neither a domineering or controlling prime minister, as I believe the individuals who have real power are the SPADs, so the special advisors, aka Don McCummings being the major player here. I believe that he is pulling the strings in bringing Boris Johnson to a certain approach on several key issues, particularly when it comes to Brexit, for instance, as well as the current lockdown. Just to clarify that Boris Johnson's leadership at the moment is seen as, or particularly I feel, is being portrayed as being weak and also being undermined as well.
Yes. I've got another quote from The Sun here. It says, under government plans, Boris wants to open schools and non-essential shops from June the 1st onwards if the rate of infection is low enough. And from the start of July, ministers are planning to try and open up even more services, possibly including restaurants, cafes and cinemas. But Boris admitted that we have to acknowledge we may need to live with this virus for some time to come, and life was far from returning to normal again. A point could be made about how the government's close down of non-essential services extended to schools, which ironically suggested that state education is non-essential, but we'll leave that aside.
A good approach, very, very good approach. Because I honestly think that the way in which the UK government under Boris at the moment has handled the idea of reopening primary schools and kindergartens and nurseries from the 1st of June is absolutely ludicrous, because how are teachers supposed to enforce the version of social distancing with young children? They're obviously not going to listen to or simply ignore what the teacher is basically saying or wanting. However, saying that, with the concept of opening secondary schools or further education colleges or even universities, go ahead, because they'll be able to enforce the idea and concept of social distancing. Opening those schools or institutions for younger, vulnerable individuals it's madness. So just don't do it. Simple.
Despite all the media noise, the move has been backed by the Association of School and College Leaders, which boasts a membership of 19,000. I think because it's only going to be students from reception, year 1 and year 6 that are going to return to school initially. Do you think the speed at which services and businesses are to reopen is just right, too fast or too slow? I
honestly think it's too fast, completely too fast. I think we should be taking a similar approach to what our European counterparts have been doing, i.e. opening them at a staggered approach and not rushing into opening particular locations like non-essential shops, for instance, and just keeping the major areas open for business. So basically keep the essential shops and industries open, but the important thing here is trying to define what is essential.
What criteria do you think we need to meet before we start moving towards normality again?
Well, most importantly is the percentage of deaths, particularly within the medical industry. I would also say ensuring that the UK has adequate plans and processes or arrangements in place to ensure they have sufficient amounts of PPE available to the medical industry as well as the general public, and a clearer commercial campaign to outline the importance of following the government's lockdown rules if this does happen again.
What do you believe will constitute the new normal? We've heard this phrase used a lot recently. And should we resist adapting to it for the long term, considering that it's quite unnatural for people to be socially distancing or not going outside?
I'd say ideally everyone would like to prefer to get back to normal, but if it's going to be used for ensuring the health of the UK, then I believe that this form of social distancing or wearing of masks in public should be enforced for a longer period. And plus, people have become used to this kind of concept of queuing outside shops to go in, one out kind of situation as well. And also the wearing of face masks as well has become quite normal in society within the UK. So I believe that there's clear demonstration that this will become part of the normality.
Just going back to what you were saying before about differences of approach, we're seeing not just a difference of approach between Scotland and England, as I highlighted last week and as you did then, but now a difference of approach between regions. So I've got another quote here from the Mirror that says, Hartlepool leaders said, given that the coronavirus cases locally continue to rise, Hartlepool Borough Council has been working with schools and we have agreed they will not reopen on Monday the 1st of June. Liverpool has confirmed that its schools will only be open to vulnerable pupils and the children of key workers on June the 1st. And Sunderland City Council leader Graham Miller described the lockdown changes as nonsense.
I would completely agree, because obviously with the uncertain approach to only opening firstly kindergarten or any other younger aged individuals' institutions clearly shows that there isn't a clear and defined understanding of the risks that would be posed by allowing the re-establishment and reopening of state education, particularly for those ages, and the idea and answers and arguments created by councils such as Liverpool shows that they believe they're making the right choice to ensure public health over education at this time. But obviously in the future, we will have to gradually completely come back to normal. But at the moment, I believe that this approach is the best way to handle the pandemic. And I believe the 1st of June, which is the Monday the 1st of June, with the idea and concept of opening schools is too early, especially with the death rates being so high as they have been. So I feel that this concept and these ideas are correctly raised in that sense.
Both the Conservative and Labour parties are taking different positions on reopening schools as well. Do you think that certain elements of the pandemic have been unduly politicised?
Of course, it's like any political parties will try to make headway on certain issues, but it just depends on how the public's opinion is viewed by them towards their situational issues.
In this sense, it may have been a lot better for the government had it made its own mind up instead of being pressured by public opinion. Turning to the world economy, we heard last week that GDP growth in Britain contracted by 2% in the first quarter. That's the sharpest contraction since the 2008 financial crisis. Businesses have been clamouring for state subsidies. This week it's been the car industry, so that's bringing back images of nationalisation and state intervention. Petrol has fallen below £1 a litre in many areas. The markets are continuing to behave erratically, and there's even been talk of an 80s-style unemployment crisis from the chief economist of the Bank of England. We've also heard of many tax rises on the horizon in order to plug the government's revenue shortfall. Are we heading back into an era of big government and industrial decline?
I honestly believe that the industrial decline has already taken place in the UK with the closure of major industries that once was the backbone to the UK economy, i.e. car manufacturing, steel production and shipbuilding, for instance. And I feel that the UK is heading towards, like it did in 2008, towards a cliff edge that they wouldn't be able to come back off. Economically, the UK is heading towards a more significantly damaging financial economic period that they once saw either during the 2008 financial crisis or even prior to that, the Great Depression of the 1920s. With the potential collapse of the international community, it's interesting to see how each country reacts to the financial markets.
What do you think the social consequences of high unemployment would be, especially on those already suffering, considering the experience of the 1980s?
I believe that those who will be affected the most will become more disillusioned towards politics within the UK, and obviously there will be a steep increase in unemployment, especially in areas which have low number of infrastructure being put towards it, so i.e. big cities such as areas of London, cities in the northeast and northwest, and some in Scotland as well, and particularly Wales. And I think this will result in there being increased disillusion towards the current government, particularly Boris Johnson, and the way in which he has handled the whole situation.
And should we as a public really have to pay for all of this, considering that the government could have prevented the worst of the pandemic by not sitting on its hands for 5 weeks before it bothered to act?
I actually think the government has obviously underreacted during the whole situation, and honestly should not give the bill to the taxpayer because it's their fault, really, because they're the ones that didn't act as soon as they knew about the ongoing or growing situation in the UK.
And to think that all of those years the Conservatives said that it was Labour who wanted to tax and spend, and now they're doing it themselves.
Well, welcome to UK politics, where politicians lie.
All right, so who are your political influencers and the associated works?
One of my most important political influencers or political thinkers that I closely associate with is the French political thinker Michel Foucault, who's known for key works within political science as well as other interdisciplinary subjects such as sociology, social policy, even foreign policy, for instance. And I'd say one of the reasons behind that choice is because of his approach to understanding and re-evaluating the way in which political science or any other social science discipline was or still is being thought about, both in a context of a 21st century thought. Another key political thinker would be Barack Obama, as I'm a strong believer in the idea of social cohesion and the idea of social democracy within not only the UK but also within the idea of an international community. So I'm a strong believer in the idea that there's a hierarchy for the world order, with the United States and Western countries being top of that ladder. However, just to clarify, that I do not take a nationalistic approach to this standing. I believe that every country has the right and the ability to establish themselves on that ranking and improve their being between the communities and actors throughout the international geopolitical system. I'd say my last political thinker that I'm mostly associated with is Adam Smith, as well as Thomas Hobbes. So the idea of citizenship for the individual over the state.
That's a very libertarian idea.
So everyone is a liberal, everyone has a libertarian concept when they're at our age. However, I'm guessing that does become stronger or weaker when everyone gets slightly past their 20s. So we'll just have to wait and see how it evolves, really. But yeah, they're my most important political thinkers or influencers.
Right. Is libertarianism the branch of politics you most closely associate with, or is it something else?
That's a good question, because obviously I do have a liberal sense of identity. Identity would be closely associated with the idea of liberalism, but in those most central versions of that. So not left, not too extreme on the political spectrum, either left or right. So I'm basically a centrist.
Do you think that the British political left will rise again in the coming few years?
I would say that the political left, with the new concept of leadership that's closely associated now with the current Labour Party, i.e. with the election of Sir Keir Starmer, as well as the Liberal Democrats, with their new resurgence and Labour's infighting coming to some sort of conclusion. I would say that the left within the UK has placed itself in a position that is significant to increase its standing within the UK's political being. This is particularly the case with the ongoing situation with the UK's departure from the European Union, aka Brexit, as I now believe that the left, the way in which they've gone about it is not the best way of doing it, but now the fact that the left has stronger leadership in fighting the idea and concept of Brexit, for instance, and the idea of nationalism in that sense, that these new forms of leadership will effectively re-establish the left as the most critical political powers. With new leadership comes new ideas and new directions.
Where do you see the political right going then?
Where do I begin? I'd say that the political right in the UK, with the demise of certain right-wing parties such as UKIP and some elements of the Conservative Party as well, I would say that the right in the UK is getting stronger. However, with their rise comes the question of, does the UK and will the UK be able to handle a severe and crippling right-wing government? So basically, Brexiteers under the direction of Boris Johnson and others within the Conservative Party, with the current political events, their power will demise at a time which they won't be expecting it. With the ongoing situation with Brexit and so on, once the whole fiasco of Brexit has been dealt with, i.e. the completion of the transition period, reaching a deal, then the extreme versions of the right within UK politics will eventually come back into line and be put in its place, so to speak.
And considering recent events, how do you see politics changing over the next few years? Is it going to become much more grassroots, and will people be more open to exploring new ideas?
With the new approaches in UK politics as well as internationally, I think there will be a larger percentage of participation within grassroots movements. So we obviously saw this with the rise of leaders within certain political parties, in particular that of Labour under Jeremy Corbyn in the recent years. But I think his or any other type of politics will see a rise in grassroots movements within the political system within the UK.
I must just point out to listeners listening into this that the reason I invited Callum on was because we both featured in a debate on Donald Trump back in 2017, early 2017, for a university radio station. I think at some point we'll have to debate again soon.
Of course.
Especially with the US presidential election at the end of the year.
We'll just have to wait and see how that ends. It's going to be a very interesting few months ahead.
Certainly. All right, well, that's been an excellent and insightful conversation, and I thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for having me on.
Right, I hope you enjoyed listening to this edition of the Libertarian Listener, and I shall see you again next time for yet more interviews.